Dawn broke under a heavy gray sky, the sea heaving in long, rolling swells. Rain swept across the deck in sheets, and every surface glistened slick with salt and wind. Yet the carriers turned steadily into the gale, engines rising, deck crews braced against the storm. One by one, American aircraft roared to life, launching where no enemy expected flight to be possible. Stay with us. Like, subscribe, and follow for the full story. In the Pacific, distance shaped every decision. The ocean was not merely a battlefield, it was the battlefield. From the first months of the war, the United States understood that whoever controlled the sea lanes and the skies above them would decide the conflict's direction and pace. Japan relied on island chains and fixed bases spread across thousands of miles. The United States relied on something more flexible, more mobile, and ultimately more decisive, the Aircraft Carrier Task Force. But operating carriers meant living with the sea in all its moods. Calm seas could turn to chaos in minutes. Wind direction, swell height, and the motion of the deck beneath a pilot's wheels dictated life or death. Launching an aircraft from a carrier was not simply opening throttle and lifting off. It required alignment, timing, coordination, and sufficient headwind. Without enough wind, an aircraft could not gain lift. Without a steady deck, wheels could slip. And without precise crew communication, disaster followed. The U.S. Navy learned early that weather could never be treated as an obstacle. It had to become a tool. By late 1942 and into 1943, American carriers were operating farther from sheltered waters and closer to open ocean environments influenced by shifting monsoon winds, cold fronts, typhoon tracks, and seasonal storms. Meteorology officers joined combat planning tables. Flight deck crews drilled in wet conditions so frequently that operating soaked was considered routine. And most importantly, American carriers were built for speed. Speed mattered. When launching aircraft, carriers turned into the wind, combining natural wind with the ship's forward motion. A fast carrier creating 30 knots of its own speed could generate launch conditions even when nature refused to cooperate. This capability became one of the defining advantages of the U.S. Navy. Japanese carriers, slower and built with different operational assumptions, could not create the same wind margins under the same conditions. Weather forecasting also differed drastically between the two sides. Japanese naval aviation depended heavily on land-based meteorological stations that struggled to provide accurate storm tracking over open ocean. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, developed floating weather stations, reconnaissance flights dedicated to front mapping, and coordination between task groups to share pressure, wind direction, and cloud ceiling data in near real time. American fleet commanders understood the ocean's behavior far more consistently. This mattered even more as both sides spread across broader operational distances. The Central Pacific campaigns demanded constant movement from one island objective to the next, Tarawa to Kwajalein, Kwajalein to Eniwetok, Eniwetok to Saipan and Tinian, and forward again to the Philippines. The faster the fleet moved, the more storms it encountered, and the faster American planners adapted. The Japanese officer corps, steeped in the early war belief that nature, especially the vast Pacific storms, would serve as a strategic barrier, assumed that severe weather meant aviation operations would halt. They believed their forces could use bad weather to reposition, resupply, or reinforce. But the U.S. Navy kept flying. If wind was low, the carriers advanced at full power. If rain obscured vision, deck crews relied on practiced hand signals and muscle memory. If the deck pitched, launch directors adjusted timing by heartbeat and instinct. It wasn't reckless confidence, it was engineering, doctrine, and discipline. By 1944, American carrier groups were no longer simply avoiding storms. They were operating through them, exploiting them, and even using them as tactical cover. Japanese commanders watching through binoculars from distant shore-based positions or escorting ships expected flight decks to go quiet when the seas rose. Instead, they saw American aircraft climbing straight into storm clouds. The ability to launch in high winds was not a single innovation, but the product of layered improvements. More powerful carrier engines generating greater headwind advantage, stronger deck arresting and barrier gear, well-trained plane handlers who understood safety under slippery conditions. A command culture that viewed weather not as a warning, but as information. This evolving doctrine shaped the next phase of the Pacific War, where weather would not slow the American advance, it would hide it. And that is where the story of stunned Japanese officers truly begins. During the long push across the Central Pacific, when storms stopped being barriers and started becoming American cover. Because as the fleet moved west, toward the Marianas, toward the Philippines, they entered regions where storms were not occasional, but constant, seasonal, and violent. And the United States kept launching planes anyway. The Central Pacific advance was not a straight line. It was a relentless sequence of operations, each requiring the carriers to push deeper into weather patterns that only grew more unpredictable. After securing the Gilberts in late 1943, the U.S. Navy moved on to the Marshalls, then the Marianas, and finally toward the Philippines. Each step westward meant entering stronger monsoon systems, tighter operational windows, and seas that could turn violent without warning. The Marianas campaign of mid-1944, including operations around Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, marked a strategic pivot. Here, the United States committed heavily to sustained carrier presence. The fleet was no longer sailing in short bursts of strikes and withdrawals. It was living at sea for weeks at a time, sometimes months. Life aboard became a rhythm of deck cycles, maintenance, ready room briefings, and constant watch. Carriers needed wind to launch aircraft. If natural wind failed, ships generated their own by turning into it and pushing speed past 25 or even 30 knots. But during the Marianas operations, the sea was not always cooperative. Swells rolled in long arcs, caused by distant storms thousands of miles away. Decks tilted unpredictably. A pitching carrier deck could rise or fall several feet in a heartbeat. Yet, the launches continued. At the same time, the Japanese Navy was learning something they had never prepared for. Their pre-war doctrine assumed weather could be a protective factor. Storm seasons, fog banks, and monsoon fronts were believed to offer windows of safety. If the enemy could not fly, a fleet could reposition. If the skies were closed, reinforcements could move. The Pacific, vast and violent, was expected to help them. But reality shifted sharply as the U.S. carrier doctrine matured. American strike groups began using storms as camouflage. They approached targets hidden by cloud layers and rainfall, emerging only when ready to strike. Radar navigation and radio discipline made this possible. Japanese officers observing the American fleet noted that weather fronts no longer slowed them. They simply changed the shape of their approach. Then came the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Although the famous aerial battle took place in largely clear weather, the strategic lead-up demonstrated the logistical maturity of the U.S. carrier fleet. They had practiced launch discipline, recovery under pressure, and deck management in all conditions, and by the time the U.S. Navy turned toward the Philippines later that year, it was entering the northeast monsoon season. Months defined by cold winds, rough seas, and shifting cloud ceilings. This was territory the Japanese assumed would slow operations. Instead, the U.S. Navy accelerated. Carrier Task Force 38, later designated Task Force 58 during certain command rotations, pressed into the Philippine Sea, operating under fast carrier doctrine that required no protected anchorages. The fleet moved constantly, refueling at sea, resupplying on the move, running engine rooms at high output to maintain wind-on-deck advantage. Japan watched and felt time collapsing. In October 1944, during the battles around Leyte Gulf, American carriers continued to fly through rain bands and winds that would have grounded most other forces. Where Japanese doctrine stressed waiting for favorable conditions, American doctrine stressed creating them. This difference grew only more noticeable as the fleet positioned for deep strikes into the South China Sea in early 1945. The winter monsoon was fully active. Winds came in powerful gusts. Swells rose steep and uneven. Salt spray carried high enough to sting eyes on the flight deck. Aircraft handlers wore gloves slick with a permanent mix of rain, oil, and aviation fuel. Yet the launch routines continued with measured calm. The Japanese, relying on reconnaissance, believed heavy storms forced flight operations to halt. They expected pauses. They anticipated gaps. But no gap came. What stunned Japanese staff, observers, and surviving officers after the war was not simply that American carriers could launch in storm conditions, but that they did so predictably, safely, and with deadly effect. The sea was no longer a neutral element. It had become a force American carriers mastered. The next phase of the story shifts from environment to the human and tactical dimension, where discipline, training, and flexibility made the difference between an aircraft clearing the deck and vanishing into the sea. Because to understand how the U.S. Navy launched planes in storm winds, we must understand the men who stood on those decks, soaked, steady, and unshaken. On the flight deck, weather was not an abstraction. It was weight, it was noise, it was motion, salt, cold, and risk layered into every task. The men who worked there, blue-shirt plane handlers, yellow-shirt directors, red-shirt ordnance crews, white-shirt safety officers, did not have the luxury of waiting for calm seas. Their world was a steel surface constantly in motion, a deck that pitched, rolled, and shuddered as the carrier cut through storm-driven swells. These men lived inside a system built on precision. A single aircraft launch was the result of dozens of hands moving in practiced coordination. Plane handlers rolled aircraft from elevators into position. Directors signaled pilots using silent hand gestures that cut through wind and engine roar. Ordnance teams secured bombs and torpedoes under conditions where one misplaced step could mean a fall into the ocean. Maintenance crews checked fuel lines, oil pressure, and control surfaces soaked by rain and salt. Safety officers watched everything, every cable, every hand signal, every spin of every propeller. When storms rose, nothing sped up. The rhythm stayed controlled. Every man on the deck knew that rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes on a wet deck could be catastrophic. Yet even under sheets of rain and wind strong enough to peel cloth from the skin, the work continued with steady, unbroken timing. These sailors were not performing heroics. They were following training. The U.S. Navy's carrier culture emphasized routine so deeply that it became instinct. Storm or calm, day or night, the launch sequence was the same. The deck became a kind of choreography. Aircraft inches apart, crew moving in predictable lanes, communications silent and unbroken. The storm did not disrupt that system. It only made every action matter more. Pilots felt the weight of the storm in a different way. Before takeoff, they watched the deck rise and fall, waiting for the launch officer's signal. They listened to the wind, felt their aircraft vibrate against chocks, and knew that once released, there was only one acceptable outcome. The aircraft must lift. If it failed to gain enough airspeed, the sea waited just beyond the bow, its surface a blend of steel-gray water and white-capped turbulence. To help them, the carrier itself participated in the launch. The ship turned directly into the wind, engines driving it forward at maximum speed. This created a rushing headwind across the deck, giving aircraft the lift they needed even when natural winds were minimal or unpredictable. It was not brute force. It was physics applied with precision. This practice was so refined that American carriers could launch aircraft in conditions where Japanese doctrine required waiting. The tactical implications were profound. If a strike was planned for sunrise, the Americans launched at sunrise, storm or no storm. If reconnaissance was needed before a fleet engagement, aircraft took off regardless of rain bands, cloud ceilings, or swell height. The U.S. Navy did not schedule operations around weather. It scheduled weather into operations, and when storms grew harsh, the Americans used them as cover. Japanese spotters found it extremely difficult to track formations through cloud and rain. Radar support on Japanese ships lagged behind. American strike groups could assemble inside weather fronts, then break out only when ready to attack. This meant the Japanese could not reliably predict approach vectors or timing. Heavy weather, once considered a natural barrier, became a strategic veil. This change was not driven by a single innovation, but by the way the U.S. Navy integrated technology, training, and tempo. Radar navigation and fighter direction kept air groups cohesive in poor visibility. Floating logistics groups allowed carriers to maintain constant pressure. Standardized launch and recovery procedures ensured muscle memory under stress. Modern carrier engines generated wind when nature did not. Meanwhile, Japanese planners, accustomed to pausing aviation in heavy weather, were left watching a fleet that seemed indifferent to the storm. The deck crews felt the danger. The pilots felt the surge. But the system held. The next perspective belongs to the commanders, the men who made decisions about launching in weather that could drown an entire attack group if misjudged. They had to balance risk, necessity, and time, and their decisions would shape the final battles of the Pacific. Leadership determined how far the U.S. Navy would push operations in heavy weather. Admirals like William Bull Halsey, Raymond Spruance, Mark Mitchell, and John McCain Sr. understood that victory in the Pacific required pressure, sustained, unbroken, unforgiving pressure. The longer a task force paused to wait for favorable weather, the more time Japan gained to reinforce, regroup, or escape. So they made a simple rule. If a mission required aircraft in the air, the fleet would launch those aircraft. Weather would be accounted for, but never allowed to dictate tempo. Admiral Mark Mitchell, in particular, was pivotal. Calm, analytical, and deeply respected by aviators, Mitchell believed in operational rhythm. A carrier air group was a living system. Launch, strike, recover, refuel, rearm, launch again. Any disruption risked losing pace, the very thing that gave American naval aviation its crushing momentum. To Mitchell, storms were factors, not obstacles. If the wind shifted, the carrier would turn. If visibility dropped, radar and disciplined flying would guide the squadrons. If the sea rose, deck handlers adjusted their footing and timing by instinct refined through repetition. Yet this approach was not reckless. The U.S. Navy had learned, sometimes painfully, that storms required respect. The fleet's experience with Typhoon Cobra in December 1944, where several destroyers capsized, underscored the danger of misreading weather systems. But even that tragedy reinforced the core principle. Understanding weather, not avoiding it, was the key. On the Japanese side, the reaction was markedly different. Japanese naval doctrine had never required routine flight operations under storm conditions. Pre-war training emphasized clear skies navigation, ceremonial precision, and ideal attack weather. Pilots launched when the air was open and seas were steady. Carriers were not expected to generate their own wind if nature failed to provide, and meteorological forecasting was comparatively weaker, relying heavily on dispersed land stations and limited upper atmosphere sampling. As a result, many Japanese commanders carried a belief that severe, weather-grounded aviation for both sides. This assumption would prove costly. When Japanese officers observed that American carriers continued to launch aircraft during storms, shock turned to confusion. Reports recovered after the war, along with interrogations of surviving Japanese staff officers, revealed repeated notes describing American naval aviation as uninterrupted, indifferent to weather, and immune to monsoon operations. The truth was more practical. The U.S. Navy had trained to treat storms as normal. Rain, crosswinds, and rough decks were not special conditions. They were expected conditions. Every takeoff was controlled risk. Every recovery was a test of nerve and timing. The storm simply intensified what the system was already designed to withstand. From the Japanese perspective, this looked like fearlessness. From the American perspective, it was procedure, and this difference shaped strategic planning. Japanese fleet movements during late 1944 and early 1945 often relied on weather for concealment. Convoys attempted to slip through rainy regions, believing aircraft would not launch. Carrier air wings in Japan were grounded outright during storm fronts to preserve fuel and airframes. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy used radar, scouting reports, and barometric drops to identify when storms would help hide their approach, and then launched anyway. Weather, once expected to act as Japan's shield, became an American blade. Everything now pointed toward the next stage, when these doctrines were tested not as theory, but in brutal operational reality. Because in early 1945, the U.S. Navy struck deep into the South China Sea during the height of the winter monsoon. Seas were rough, winds were strong, visibility shifted without warning. The Japanese believed the Americans would wait. Instead, the carriers turned into the storm and launched. By January 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase defined by movement, momentum, and exhaustion. The U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, now operating under the designation Task Force 38, had become a constant presence along the Philippine Arc. Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing. Supply lines to the resource fields of Southeast Asia were failing. But one major artery remained: shipping routes through the South China Sea. This body of water was vast, storm-lashed, and historically considered difficult for aviation operations during the winter monsoon. Winds drove long, cold waves across the sea surface. Cloud ceilings shifted unpredictably. Rain arrived in sudden, heavy bursts. For decades, naval planners had viewed these waters as a seasonal barrier to large-scale air operations. The Japanese still believed that. The United States no longer did. On January 6, 1945, Task Force 38 pushed westward through the Luzon Strait, one of the most dangerous ocean choke points in the region. It was winter, and the northeast monsoon was at full power. Whitecaps hammered steel hulls. Wind howled across exposed decks. Crests broke as high as the catwalks along the carrier flanks. Every hour at sea came with a reminder. One miscalculation, and even a modern warship could be taken by the storm. Yet the American carriers pressed forward. The goal was simple and decisive: cut Japan's supply lifeline by destroying shipping. Airfields, fuel depots, and naval bases across the South China Sea coastline. The strike would hit Saigon, Hong Kong, Cam Ranh Bay, Formosa, Indochina, and shipping lanes stretching to Singapore. It was an operation that required endurance, accuracy, and above all, air power. But to use air power, the carriers had to launch planes, and they had entered a region where launching aircraft was considered nearly impossible. At dawn on January 12, 1945, the first major launch of the campaign began. The sea rolled in relentless, uneven rhythm. The carrier USS Lexington, followed by USS Enterprise, USS Essex, USS Hancock, USS Hornet, and others, turned sharply into the wind. The sudden maneuver caused waves to break across the bow in fans of cold spray. Deck crews blinked into the salt and rain. The metallic roar of aviation engines cut through the wind. On deck, propellers spun into shimmering blurs. The launch cycle began. Yellow shirt directors raised their arms, signaling forward. Chocks lifted. Throttle advanced. Engines surged. Every launch in storm conditions required a shared instinct, timing with the ship's motion. The deck rose and fell beneath the aircraft's wheels. A mistimed release could send a fighter sliding forward before lift took hold. But the crews had trained for this. In calm seas, in rough seas, in drill after drill after drill, they had prepared for moments exactly like this. The first wave of F-6F Hellcats lifted from the deck, wheels retracting smoothly as they climbed into the wind. SB-2C Helldivers followed, carrying bombs and fuel for long-distance strikes. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers rose last, engines roaring against the storm's pull. The Japanese had not expected this. Their coastal observation stations, positioned to track enemy movements, believed the Americans would delay operations until weather stabilized. Airfields were not fully manned. Anti-aircraft gunners were not at peak readiness. Ships were refueling and restocking in harbor, assuming temporary safety under heavy cloud cover. The first sign of danger came not from horizon silhouettes, but from the sound of aircraft engines emerging. Out of the storm itself, American planes dropped through the cloud layers and into attack dives. At Cam Ranh Bay, fuel storage tanks erupted in fire. At Saigon, warehouses and shipping terminals burned. In the Gulf of Tonkin, convoy ships attempted to scatter under plume-blackened skies. Destroyers tried to raise steam and maneuver, but too late. Over 250 Japanese ships were sunk or damaged across the strike period. Supply chains that had taken years to assemble were severed in days. The heavy storm that the Japanese believed would protect them now hid the attackers instead. Meanwhile, on the carriers, the launches continued without pause. Flight deck crews worked soaked, wind-beaten, and focused. Pilots returned through rain and turbulence, relying on shipboard radar and landing signal officers to guide them back to the deck. Recovering aircraft in a storm required even greater precision than launching them. Yet, sorties returned, reloaded, and launched again. Every component of the American carrier system was being tested. Not in theory, but in violent practice. It held Japanese commanders. Reviewing reports from the South China Sea strikes, wrote that the Americans had demonstrated a capability that exceeded expectation. They noted that U.S. Naval Aviation showed confidence under conditions considered impossible and continuous action regardless of storm or cloud. 3. Shock was not emotional. It was strategic. If weather no longer hindered U.S. carrier operations, there were no natural pauses left for Japan to exploit. The South China Sea raids proved a singular truth. American carriers were not limited by the environment. They had mastered it, but the most dramatic demonstration of storm-resistant carrier aviation was still to come. It would occur weeks later, off Okinawa, against the most formidable surface warship Japan had ever completed. The battleship Yamato was preparing to sail, and the Americans would launch to intercept through rising storm winds. By early April 1945, the war was converging on Okinawa. The island was the last major stepping stone before Japan itself. The fighting on land was bitter, slow, and unrelenting. Offshore, the U.S. Navy maintained a vast and complex shield of ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels stretching across miles of ocean. This was the largest naval operation of the Pacific War. But among all the forces converging on Okinawa, one threat still lingered: the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. Yamato represented Japan's last remaining offensive symbol. With Japan's carrier air wings shattered and fuel supplies depleted, the Imperial Navy authorized Operation Ten-Go, a one-way sortie. Yamato would sail south from the home islands, accompanied by light escorts, attempt to reach Okinawa, and beach herself to act as a stationary coastal battery. There was no plan for return. It was a final gesture of defiance, a naval act of sacrifice. What Japanese planners believed would help this mission was weather. Early April in the east, China Sea brought unstable fronts, intermittent rains, and heavy winds. They assumed American carriers would have difficulty launching reconnaissance and strike aircraft in such conditions. Yamato might move unseen. Yamato might arrive. But Task Force 58 had already shown, again and again, that storm winds were not deterrents. On the morning of April 7, 1945, radar aboard the carriers detected the Japanese surface group. Weather conditions were deteriorating. Light faded behind heavy storm clouds, and swells deepened beneath the fleet. Rain swept across the decks in rushing waves. To launch would require perfect timing, coordination, and trust in the flight crews and deck officers. And the order was given. The carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Bennington, and Hancock, turned into the wind. Massive bow wakes fanned outward, white spray rising high against the hulls. Pilots strapped into F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBM Avengers, the same airframes that had flown at Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and the South China Sea. The deck pitched, rising and falling, like a living surface. Launch officers waited for the crest. A signal arm dropped, engines roared forward. One aircraft after another accelerated. Across steel slicked with rain and salt spray. Bomb racks were heavy, wings flexed under strain, and pilots felt both the pull of the ocean below and the headwind above. But the training held. Aircraft lifted cleanly, climbing into low clouds and fading into gray sky. Soon the air groups formed, circling, assembling strike waves in the murk. Radar direction coordinated headings. Radio silence held until attack vectors were confirmed. Pilots navigated by instrument and instinct, punching through cloud layers until the ocean reappeared beneath them. Below, the Yamato task force pushed south at flank speed. Her escorting destroyers cut sharp wakes through the sea, anti-aircraft crews at their stations. Yamato's massive 18.1-inch main battery, the largest naval guns ever mounted to a warship, was pointed forward, though they were nearly useless against high-flying aircraft. She was built to fight battleships, not fleets of dive bombers. The Americans descended. Helldivers came first, rolling into steep attack dives despite turbulent wind shear. Bomb fins shrieked in the slipstream. Explosions rippled across Yamato's deck as 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs struck home. Avengers followed, flying low beneath low clouds and heavy winds. Torpedoes released at precise angles, skimming across the surface before slamming into the battleship's hull. Water plumed high around Yamato as shock waves tore through her side. Her escorts fought with intensity. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky with black smears. Destroyers maneuvered to block torpedo lanes. Sea spray, rain, wind, smoke, and flame blurred into one shifting storm of motion. But the attack did not stop. Strike waves rotated, refueled, rearmed, and returned. Launches and recoveries continued despite the sea's constant motion. The system held, again. The storm was no shield. It was the environment the Americans had mastered. Yamato listed. Fires spread. Magazine spaces sealed. Pumps failed. A final torpedo strike caused a catastrophic internal detonation. The blast was so massive, it sent a column of fire and smoke towering into the sky, visible across the horizon. The largest battleship in history rolled and sank in seconds. Over 3,000 Taothus, Japanese sailors were lost. The sea swallowed the last symbol of Imperial Navy surface power. Japanese officers, watching later from coastal stations, interrogated after the war, or reading reports of the strike, recorded the same shock. The Americans launched and sustained full strike operations in weather conditions believed impossible. Storm winds did not slow them. Rough seas did not restrict them. Clouds did not hide their approach. The lesson was now unmistakable. Weather was no longer a strategic barrier. It was an American battlefield advantage. The fall of Yamato did not end the war, but it ended the idea that Japan could halt American momentum by relying on nature. The storm had chosen no side. The carriers had simply learned how to fly through it. The sinking of Yamato did more than remove a battleship from the Imperial Navy's order of battle. It marked the collapse of an entire strategic belief system. For decades, Japan had counted on geography and season to shape the limits of naval action. Monsoon rain, shifting winds, and the long Pacific swells were assumed to be natural barriers that slowed war. Nature, in this view, was a defensive ally. But the U.S. Navy had spent the war learning the opposite lesson. The ocean was not a wall. It was a platform. The ability to use weather as a tool, not merely endure it, was the final expression of U.S. carrier aviation maturity. By 1945, the United States had achieved something unprecedented: carriers that could operate continuously for months. Pilots able to fly in cloud, turbulence, and limited visibility. Deck crews who could work wet or dry, day or night, under fire or under storm. Ships powerful enough to generate their own launching wind. A command system able to coordinate hundreds of aircraft at once. Everything worked together. Everything reinforced everything else. This was the Carrier Task Force doctrine, refined through necessity, perfected through repetition. In Japanese post-war analyses, staff officers repeatedly pointed to one detail that surprised them most: the lack of hesitation. American carriers did not wait for conditions to become favorable. They created their own conditions. If visibility dropped, radar guided the formation. If wind shifted, the carrier turned. If the sea rose, timing adjusted with muscle memory. The U.S. Navy's relationship with the sea was neither romantic nor fatalistic. It was procedural, practical, structured, trained. This was not charisma. It was not luck. It was not daring for its own sake. It was system. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, entered the war with brilliant individual aviators and strong early war tactical instincts, but lacked the logistics, standardization, and training repetition required to sustain operations when the environment worsened. Weather disrupted Japanese planning because Japanese planning required weather to cooperate. American planning required weather only to be measured. The consequences extended far beyond the end of the war. After 1945, the U.S. Navy built training programs explicitly designed to replicate the conditions of the Pacific War. Carrier qualifications in rough seas, night flight training, instrument-only navigation drills, storm deck handling exercises, meteorology and aerology as core naval sciences. This shift reshaped naval aviation for generations. A pilot in 1950, 1970, or 2000 inherited the habits learned in the winter monsoon of 1944-45. The legacy of storm operations traveled into the Korean War, Vietnam, the Cold War patrols of the Western Pacific, and modern carrier strike groups circling the globe today. Every modern carrier captain stands on a bridge shaped by the lessons learned launching aircraft in seas that rose and broke across the bow of USS Essex, USS Hancock, and USS Enterprise. And every pilot today, eyes fixed on horizon, altimeter steady, wings trimmed against gusting wind, carries the unseen memory of those who flew through storm layers toward Yamato. The Japanese officers who observed American operations during the final phase of the war described them as persistent, unbroken, and, technically, contained. There was no bravado, no theatrical gestures, Just methodical continuation of mission under conditions that previously halted naval action entirely. This, more than any single battle, defined American naval dominance, not size. Not firepower, not even industry, but the ability to maintain operational tempo when the ocean itself tried to stop the fight. The sea did not grant victory. Victory came from mastering the sea. The Pacific is vast, restless, and without mercy. Storms sweep across it with no regard for men or nations. Waves rise from winds borne thousands of miles away. Clouds gather not for tactics, but because the world is in motion. In that space, unbounded, shifting, and uncertain, the United States learned how to move, launch, recover, and strike. Not by overpowering nature, but by understanding it, measuring it, working within it. Where others saw storms as barriers, America saw open sky. And in that moment, amid wind, rain, waves, and steel, history changed course over a deck slick with salt and courage.